Yes, it's now, okay.
Let me see how I can do that. Oh.
I already started, Kristan, with the record.
Oh yeah, awesome. So today's talk is about a particular intervention against coronavirus, namely to regularly test people in contact with particular risk groups to help prevent them from getting infected. And it is kind of a bit off topic, maybe here, because usually I'm a malaria researcher, as you know, but this year the world kind of changed. So that oops, something is happening here with the slides. Give me a second. Give me a second to fix that. Let me see what's going on here. Sometimes I'm having these problems with the Acrobat, but we're going to yeah, no, I should. Okay, let's try again. Okay, are the slides shown? Good. So the world that we now let's see what's going on there. Maybe it should slow speed. Let me. Okay. Let me try something different. Acrobat is giving me troubles. Let me quit it and this may be a different PDF viewer. Okay. Okay. Are the slides shown?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, great. Let's try. Let's try that. So that's the world that we know have been known so far in infectious diseases, right? With the big three, like with the ever-cloning bacteria of tuberculosis, the complicated malaria with all its sexual and asexual forms, HIV being the #1 virus, and well, since this year, a new pathogen obviously crowned itself, and that is known as omen, coronavirus, that actually also by now caused 35 million confirmed infections, and now officially over 1 million deaths, with a much higher number of unreported cases, obviously. And it also, infects well, royals and other prominent, and well, today even the U.S. president and his first lady were tested positive. Now, just to wrap that up, so the virus itself was named severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2. It's a coronavirus like SARS-1 or MERS. It causes coronavirus disease 2019 or COVID-19. And well, it's airborne and extremely contagious. And we've seen all these kind of pictures in now in this pandemic. And that is a particularly nice picture because you see essentially that these healthcare workers are going to infect themselves if these people really have coronavirus, because the guy in front first, he's kind of lifting his facial mask so it's not properly sealed. He's not wearing his eye protection, his goggles, so he's going to get infected via the eyes. He's not wearing the gloves properly. You can even see the skin through. And the gentleman in the back is wearing the goggles, but he's wearing the wrong mask to prevent himself from infection, right? So it is so contagious that even people, you know, with this gear, if they're not properly using it, will get infected. And obviously symptoms range in most cases from asymptomatic, but it can be very severe, causing diffuse pneumonia and then death by inflammatory reactions and a multiple organ failure. And here we see like an X-ray of a COVID patient on the right. You see these white shades of the diffuse pneumonia that you see over both lungs. So, you know, such a pneumonia, you know, obviously are doomed to go on the breathing machine soon. And so the virus itself, the disease is something extremely serious, obviously. And since the beginning, actually, the number of cases in elderly citizens was extremely high. And so the Johns Hopkins University, the World Health Organization, they all defined people aged 65 plus a particular risk group. And in Germany, for instance, every second COVID-related death occurred inside a long-term care facility, so the homes for the elderly. And that is substantial. And I have the German numbers here. So Germany has a population of about 83 million, and 3.4 million depend on nursing. 66% of them over 90 years of age. So Germany has an old population. And long-term care facilities in Germany have a capacity of about more than 100,000 beds. Well, they have a higher capacity, but about 700,000 filled beds, and 0.72 million full stationary. The whole system of long-term care facilities in Germany is sustained by about the same number, 0.76 million employees. Not all of them really working inside the nursing home or in the nursing sector. In particular, a lot of them are in administration, maintenance, housekeeping, gardeners, everything. Yeah? And since it is a substantial proportion of the population, and every second COVID-related death occurs in such a facility, the question obviously arises how to protect this risk group, and there are several guidelines to do so. Now, one is, well, we need to filter out the contact persons that can actually import it into such a facility, because once it is inside such a facility, it's going to spread like a wildfire in there. Now, so that means, well, the people that go daily in and out there are the employees. So should one test them regularly? Does it has a positive effect? Well, the same rationale applies to incarceration facilities. So here you see a picture from Tent City from Arizona, where I start doing my malaria research. Sheriff Joe has tons of prisoners, and inside such incarceration facilities, notoriously difficult to spread. I mean, look at the ladies at one of Sheriff Joe's chain gangs. You have a lot of people in the US correctional system, 6.4 million. Even Mike Tyson, he was once a guest of Sheriff Joe in Tent City. And you really have over 2 million incarcerated. And what is important is inside such facilities, the inmates older than 55, 60, 65 years of age quadrupled in the last, well, since the early 90s, or in the 90s to the early 2000s. So there's a rapidly increasing elderly population in US prisons. So it's a high risk group in there too. Okay, now the question of this talk, what is it about? Can one protect a risk group inside a closed facility by testing contact persons or contact person to the outside world? And so for that, we're going to use a mathematical model to predict the effect of different interventions. And these different interventions are, well, a general contact reduction, so lockdown, curfews, social distancing, that were in place anyway. Yeah, I mean, by now in the pandemic, I mean, you had a lockdown in most countries anyway, of one kind or the other. Then there's case isolation. So you put people that are infected with COVID into quarantine, either in a quarantine ward or into home isolation. And well, the real important intervention here that we want to see how effective that is screening contact persons of the risk group. So in our case, it will be the employees in these facilities. And so we want to ask the questions, are these interventions efficient? Are the interventions realistic? And what are the costs? Now let's give me, since I know I'm not talking to a group of mathematicians today, so let's do a little crash course in modeling. So what is true is that all models are wrong, but some are useful. So you always have simplifications of reality. Yeah. So as an illustration, so that is how our planet looks. Actually, I took a shot where you see Peru, and you see the beautiful Andes. And so that is how our planet looks without the oceans. Now, usually in a model, well, you idealize it, yeah. So you would model it like an ellipsoid, yeah, or even like a ball, or in some models you do it as a mass point. Yeah, it depends on which granularity you get and what the purpose of your model is. But definitely you can also do the wrong. models. Yeah, like something like the Earth is flat is a it's obviously a wrong, totally BOGO model, which is actually a very nice illustration here, because in these believers in the flat Earth, actually our planet can be flat, but there are other planets around. So let's see. Now let's do a kind of SIR-like models. Yeah. So SIR-like models, so that stands for susceptible, infective, recovered, and those are mathematical models. And typically what one does is one follows the number of individuals as differential, modeled as differentiable function of time. Now, how is that possible? So typically what we see is we have individuals, yeah, we follow those, the number of some individuals over time. Yeah, and obviously it is individuals, so it's something discrete. Yeah, so imagine it's the number of infected individuals, right? And so they are increasing and then they decrease a bit, so on. But it's in discrete chunks, right? That is what's going on in the real world. But you know, if you have a lot of population and you zoom out of that, well, you have a lot of them, then it looks a bit more smooth, right? And if you zoom out further, it looks even smoother. And so as an approximation for this kind of models, you just model it as a function of time that is nice and smooth and differentiable. And that is justified if the number of individuals that you consider in a population is large. Okay, and large also means typically we can neglect randomness, or at least for the relevant parts of what we want to study. Okay, and essentially individuals are kind of clones of each other. They are like supposed to be in their characteristics equivalent. Okay, now let's actually see how a little toy model looks. Well, maybe we should say events. Well, so it's we model time continuously, and so all events, which might be birth, death, infection, non-infection, infection, recovery, occur on a continuous time scale. So we can model it nicely by a differentiable function. Okay, now let's make a toy example. Let's have, we have a population with two types of individuals. We have nice individuals and we have nasty individuals, okay? And in our model, just for an illustration, well, we follow the number of nice and nasty individuals in time, and capital A of t and capital B of t are the numbers of the nice and nasty individuals at time t. Okay, and what can happen is, well, nice individuals can, let's say, turn to nasty, right? And so turning from nice, well, they ultimately turn from nice to nasty. If you remember these individuals, those were the gremlins, right? So assume they all have eaten after midnight. So now they turn into nasty creatures. And that takes, on average, 1 over alpha time units. In our case, it will be days. So we will illustrate that typically by graphic, by flow diagram. We have type A, and they can they can change to B. That's where the arrow is pointing to. Now we need to see what this alpha here means. Okay, so let's consider duration. Yeah, let's say 1 by alpha is 3 days. So it takes 3 days to turn from nice to nasty. And so one individual in 3 days should actually, well, you have, in 3 time units, one individual got essentially nasty. Yeah. So if we look at that, so how many did get nasty in 1 time unit? Well, then you just do this essentially these similar triangulars, and you see, well, this one by alpha to 1 is alpha to 1. So it is alpha individuals. Well, alpha is of course not an integer in general, but whatever fraction, yeah? Of course, you don't have alpha individuals, but since we model it continuously, it's okay to do so. And so in whatever delta t time units, let's do some delta t, the number of individuals will be alpha times delta t. So that means in, delta t time units, approximately, delta t times alpha individuals, well, turn from nice to nasty. Well, and we have, that is delta t times alpha is the part of one individual, so to speak, but we have at time t, capital A of t individuals. So that is the number of individuals that went from nice to nasty. So we can write it down in an equation. So we can say, well, the number of nice individuals at time t plus delta t is essentially the number of individuals that we had at time t minus those that turned to be nasty, which is capital A of t times delta t times alpha. Okay. And the same is now how did the numbers of nasty individuals change? Well, they go in time, well, they change in delta t time units by having their old number, plus the number of nasty individuals that, the number of nice individuals that become nasty. Here we have a little typo. Okay, so let's go again to this equation. Yeah, so we can actually take this equation and well, do some algebraic manipulation and see, well, the change in the numbers divided by time unit delta t is minus alpha times A of t. Yeah? And we can do the same thing for the second equation. And if we let delta t be small, then approximately we get this following system of differential equations. So the time change of the function a is minus a times a, and the same for b. Okay, so that's it. And this equation, we couldn't care less. Actually, we don't need it for the understanding at all. That's the cool thing with this type of models. So that's actually a very simple system of differential equations, can be solved, and here's a solution, assuming that initially we had 10,000 nice individuals and 0 nasty, and so you see the number of nice individuals declines and the number of nasty individuals increases. So that is essentially the turn from nice to nasty. Okay, and you don't really need the equations. The only thing that you need is this flow chart. Yeah, you need this rate alpha. There it is. That is the rate of the change. So you have from compartment A, you know, at a rate alpha, you leave this compartment and arrive in B. So that's the way you write down these models graphically, and that is more than enough that we need. Okay, now what is the implication of this model? Well, the model actually assumes that any time, well, on average, it takes 1 over alpha time units to turn from nice to nasty, but it can actually happen anywhere in this time. And the resulting, well, the solution is, well, this curve, which is essentially an exponential distribution. And that is a kind of characterizes a distribution that it has a mean time to turn from nice to nasty of 1 by alpha and a variance of 1 by alpha squared. Now this variance is something that we don't like too much because the variance is rather high. That's due to this exponential function that we're implicitly modeling, but we're going to resolve that later on. Okay, but that is essentially how this model works. Now, you really don't need to do the math. You just need to be able to read the diagrams, and that will do the job. Okay, so well, again, with this kind of very simple model, well, and this model is of course pretty just for illustration purposes. Well, the variance is too high, so it takes kind of the variance. So some individuals turn immediately from nice to nasty, and some others, well, for those it takes very long to turn from nice to nasty. So for a proper model, we get to tweak that a bit, and we will do that later. Okay, now let's actually go to what we have in mind, and that is coronavirus. So let's look at our setup. So we have a heterogeneous population. So we mainly have a big population that is diverse and interacting, and then we have long-term care facilities. And in these long-term care facilities, we have a resident risk group of elderly individuals. And well, they are locked in there, so they have contacts among themselves. Well, and then you have kind of a link to the outside world, which is the employee population, yeah, or well, let's call it the staff. So we call it GE for general staff, for the staff population, and RI for the risk population. So that is essentially our setup. Now, of course, they don't interact randomly in the population. You got to consider the structure that they have. Well, there might be some individuals in the general population that have a lot of contacts with the risk group, and they because they would frequently visit. But actually, most contacts of the risk groups is with the employees, with the staff population that you have in these facilities, and also the staff population itself interacts a lot amongst themselves, because after all they are co-workers, yeah, and so for most of the day they are with their colleagues. And well, the general population, after all, you know, interacts mostly among themselves. So most contacts that really occur, yeah, in the population is in the general population with the general, and they have rather few contacts with the staff population. Well, of course, the staff is part of the general population, so to speak, right? They also go in the grocery store, yeah, they go and have a beer after work with them and whatever. But obviously it's a much smaller part of the population, and a good chunk of the contacts that they are having is among the co-workers anyway. And then, well, you have only a few that go and have contacts with people, with prison inmates, or with people in long-term care facilities, right? So that is actually a very small chunk. Now, the risk group with itself has most contacts really with itself, right? And with the staff, and maybe with the outside world. And of course, contacts are symmetric. So this matrix of contact behavior must be symmetric. So each contact of general with risk group is the same as the contact of the risk group with the general population, obviously. And this matrix is not random, okay? Because, well, if you would just randomly toss together two individuals from the risk group, well, or if you randomly pick individuals of the total population, the probability that you pick two of the risk group having a contact together will be very, very very low, yeah? And that is definitely overrepresented in these long-term care facilities. So there is definitely a heterogeneous contact structure that is key important to be captured. Okay. Now, of course, you can take this matrix and write it in a more mathematical form. Well, that you don't need to have a photographic memory or anything. Yeah, it's rather simple to do. Actually, yeah, you have the number of individuals in the general population, let's say, and they have a number of contacts on average, little n. So that would be the number of all contacts they have. And then a good proportion, let's say x, well, is among the general population, among itself. And well, another proportion is having contacts with the staff, and the rest then with the risk group, right? And so it's the same for the others. And these proportions, x, y, whatever, you have a lot of letters here. They don't really matter here. We don't need them in detail. They are constrained, yeah, in a way that this matrix is symmetric because contacts are obviously symmetric. Okay, so what we need is these total contacts are kind of reflecting deviations from random encounters. And this will be captured in a matrix. Yeah, and by the way, this matrix will be time dependent because the contact behavior itself, you know, also changes due to the interventions we are imposing. Okay. So let's go to the model. Yeah. So what we're modeling is we model a population first. Let's first consider just the general population. We have a population of susceptible individuals, so they are corona-free and they can get the virus. Then, you know, if somebody that is susceptible is infected, or becomes infected, well, they become first latently infected. So in this latent phase, and they stay there, well, they remain there, that takes this latent phase, takes an average duration, yeah, whatever, let's call it DE. And during this phase, they cannot spread the disease, the virus yet. They are infected, but they don't have any symptoms yet, and they are not infected. Okay, from there, they will progress to the prodromal phase. So in the prodromal phase, typically, although they don't have any symptoms yet, but they are already moderately infected. Not completely, but to a certain degree. Yeah? And you know that phase takes also certain durations, and then they progress to the fully contagious state where the symptoms start, or symptoms may start. Some infections will stay asymptomatic, some others become symptomatic, and typically it will start in this phase. Yeah, and it has also some average duration in the eye. And then you go to the late infectious stage. Yeah, so here you are no longer completely infective. Yeah, so actually the disease actually somehow progresses or fades. And from there, two things can happen. Either an individual recovers and they are immune. We just assume they are permanently immune for this model. Yeah? We don't have to, but let's keep things simple. Or they die. Okay, and so those two things can happen. So that is essentially what can happen. So somebody that is susceptible, either they remain, and you just need to follow the arrows. Yeah. So if somebody is susceptible, well, either they remain there or they are moved forward, either ultimately to being recovered and immune or dead. Okay, good. And so if you take a model like that, the dynamics look typically like that. Yeah? So I have a population of 100,000 individuals here, which is still small. You know, well, I don't have 100,000, but it's the number per normalized per 100,000. So we start with a population that is fully susceptible, and we have one infected case. And then, you know, well, you see the number of susceptible individuals goes down, whereas the number of infected individuals goes up. Those would be the fully contagious individuals. And then, well, finally, they recover. Those are the recovered individuals. Yeah, and then you have dead individuals. Well, they are actually the bottom line. So we have very small mortality here that is assumed in this example. So that's how it typically looks. And so the number of infection, that is what we always refer to, think about this epidemic or pandemic peaks. Now the trained eye tells you, well, that model is very simplistic because the dynamics are not realistic. We want dynamics that look more like the dashed line. We want to have, actually such a epidemic should spread faster, right? And should have a higher peak. Yeah, and what is the discrepancy between these curves? Well, in the original solid lines, the waiting times to pass through this curriculum, so to speak, are exponentially distributed. So they have a much too large variance. Yeah, some progress much too fast. Some will be instantaneously from being infected that, yeah, and others, for those, it will take forever. And that's unrealistic. Yeah? So we got to model it in a way that we shrink down this variance. And if we do that, actually we would arrive at the dashed lines. Now, how do we do that? Well, for that, we are using a simple modeling trick. So we are just multiplying all these stages into different substages. Yeah. So now you don't have one latent state, but let's say little n states. Yeah. So H will always stand in the in what comes either for E, which are the latent, for the prodromal, the full contagious, or the late infected. And if you model it in that way, and those are equivalent states where you just pass through with a certain rate, but the effect of doing so is that the waiting time to move from one phase to the next is no longer exponential distributed, but Erlang distributed. And that actually will have the same mean, but you can actually adjust the variance as you please. And that is what we want, and that makes a more realistic dynamics. So, well, let's see what we have. What are these letters now? By the way, everything that is in Greek is a rate. And a rate always has the unit 1 over time. Yeah? So, and the rate with which they progress through the latent states is epsilon, and that is just the number of Erlang states that we model, so the number of substates, are divided by the average duration of the latent phase. Yeah? And the same is true for the other rates, for the in the prodromal phase, in the fully contagious phase, and in the late infectious phase. Okay, good. Now speaking about symptoms, here in our fully contagious phase, we're going to assume that a fraction F6 of infections becomes symptomatic. So either with mild or severe symptoms. And we further assume that a fraction F that of these symptomatic infections are lethal. Yeah? So they will ultimately lead to death. Okay. So essentially, that is the first part of the model. Now that was for the general population. Now we also have a risk group. So we need to model the risk group separately. And that's how we do it. So we essentially have the same compartment only for the risk group, and we'll give it like a different superscript. Yeah. Also, don't worry too much about the notation and so on. If it's too much formulas, you know, it's better to work actually in the visualization than really writing down the formula most of the time. So the risk group is particular because what is different is, well, definitely the risk group gets sick with a higher probability upon infection than somebody in the general population, in the rest of the population. That's why they are a risk group, right? So they get their own fraction of individuals, infected individuals becoming sick, and that always is kind of also indicated. Eh? And also the risk group is more likely to die from asymptomatic infection. So that's the reason why we need to model that really separately. We need to keep track who's from the risk group, who from the general population. Okay, and then we also have the staff. And the staff are those that are interacting mostly with the risk group. Now for the staff, we essentially have the same. Yeah, only the staff, well, they behave pretty much like the general population. Well, I mean, after all, they're still in their years of employment, so everything's good with them. Now, the intervention that we want to actually model is, can we protect the risk group by actually testing the staff population regularly and filtering them and sorting and isolating out those that are infected before they can actually infect the risk group. So it is not sufficient to just model the staff population. We need to keep track of who is tested positive and who not, okay? And we're going to assume that we use something like a PCR test, okay? So PCR tests have very good specificity, so we can ignore kind of false positives. So we don't need to model that. We just need to model positively tested. So all positives will be true positives. Okay, so we need to match all the compartments that we have. Yeah, staff in the susceptibles, well, they will always be tested negative if tested. Now, if they are in the latent phase, well, they can be tested false negative. Well, the tests are not 100% sensitive, obviously, especially not in the early stage of the infection, but some might become tested positive. Okay, and so we have those individuals that are not yet tested positive, although they are infected, and we have those that are confirmed positive cases. Now, definitely the testing intervention, we test at whatever rate. No? So regularly, everybody in the staff population will be tested. And the test has a different sensitivity depending on the phase of the infection. Right? Like in the latent phase, you should have low sensitivity. In the fully contagious, you should have higher sensitivity. And at the end of the infection, you should have lower sensitivity. Again, if it's a PCR test, if it would be like an antigen test, well, the sensitivity would go up in the later stages. And what is important is tests are not issued on the spot. Yeah, it takes time to process tests, right, in the lab. So, and that we will have a waiting time, let's say 1 by alpha for the test results. So we need to model this time delay properly. And we do that with a modeling trick. We are modeling another, group of compartments. And so those are staff indicated with a star. So those are infected, they are tested, and their test results are positive, will be positive, only they have not received the result yet. Yeah? So in those compartments here, they behave just like the staff that is not yet tested positive. And they are waiting for their results. And so individuals are moved at a rate, the testing rate multiplied by the respective sensitivity in these compartments, right? And from these compartments here they wait. Yeah? And with an average time of 1 by alpha, they are receiving the results, and then they are moved in one of the positively tested or the confirmed compartments. Okay. And so those are the ones we need, because once they are confirmed positive, we will immediately kind of restrict all the contacts with the risk group. Okay, now let's do some kind of interventions that we will impose. The first is general contact reduction. So like curfews, canceling of mass gatherings, etc. And so that is assumed during some time interval. That's essentially, imagine the time, the days the lockdown lasted in your country. We restrict the general population avoids a fraction of their contacts. The staff avoids a fraction of their contacts. The risk group avoids a fraction of their contacts. Yeah? And remember, contact behavior is symmetric. So they are linked together, these fractions. Okay. And then, of course, well, we separately model, or we particularly look at the contacts between the general population and the risk group that are avoided, which is pretty easy during a lockdown where you just say you have 0 contacts, okay? So you don't let anybody in the facility that is not working there or living there, yeah? And then, well, they are properly sealed. And the amount of contacts that you can avoid depends, is also not even. Like in the staff population, the employees, the nurses, they have to be in very close interactions. They have to nurse stationary patients in those residents in those facilities. So they cannot avoid each contact. They can only avoid so many of them. They can protect themselves to efficiently reduce the number of infective contacts, but it depends pretty much on the implicit structure of the population. Okay, and so, well, the general contact reduction is essentially the lockdown, which just means a fraction of contacts in each group is avoided. Then the next kind of protection mechanisms that you have are case isolation and risk group protection. Now, case isolation. So during an interval, so typically, well, you have a certain number of cases in your country and you think, well, we should isolate COVID patients, yeah? And then you start doing that, and essentially you keep it on for a year, 2. You keep these measures on. That means, like, within this time frame, if somebody is sick, they have to go for 14 days into home isolation or something, right? Or into a quarantine ward. And so what we assume here is all symptomatic cases in the risk group are isolated. That is very simple, yeah? So they are residents in this facility. This facility, usually they can turn parts of these facilities into isolation wards. So it's very easy to isolate patients in there. It's very expensive. It's very expensive too, but it's doable. And now all symptomatic cases are isolated. In the risk group. Now, in the general population, well, it's not as easy. Okay, there might be some individuals with mild symptoms, but they are not diagnosed with COVID. They think they have the flu. They don't go to the doctor, yeah? They have some kind of symptoms. but they're not isolated. No? So in the general population and in the staff, only a fraction of symptomatic infections will be isolated. Yeah? And so these, and that is that fraction that will be diagnosed with COVID, and they will go in quarantine units. And these quarantine units are perfect, but of course they don't have unlimited capacity. So eventually, if the maximum capacity is reached, they have to go into home isolation, which is not perfect. So you don't avoid all contacts there. And well, what we also can easily do is, once somebody in the general population or in the staff population is in home isolation, it's very easy to avoid the contact with the risk group. Well, they're in home isolation, they don't go in the long-term care facility. Yeah? So, and that is clear. And now the new intervention that we're doing is that if the staff is tested positive, then they go into isolation, either at home or in a ward, and they don't have any more contact with the risk group. Well, if they are in home isolation, they might still have contacts with themselves. I mean, if they share the same household, they still have contacts in home isolation. And the same is true with staff and the general population. But everybody in the staff population and the general population, once in home isolation, they can be isolated from the risk group. Okay. Now we have contacts between the general and the risk group. Although these contacts should be kind of reduced. If the general contact reduction is no longer in place, because it would be ridiculous to test the staff population on a daily basis or whatever, or regularly, and avoid all infective contacts, but let everybody else from the outside world go in the facility. That would be ridiculous, right? So you also have restricted access, to a certain extent. It doesn't mean you cut all contact with the outside world, but at least a certain proportion, something meaningful. Okay, so that's essentially the model. Let's see how such a model is done. It should give you a bit of details. I guide you through a few formulas, but the formulas itself is not so much the issue here. So like all these isolation mechanisms lead essentially to effective numbers of individuals that can infect susceptibles. For instance, in the general population, the effective number of fully contagious individuals that can infect somebody, well, that would be the total number of all of those that are infected, minus those that are put into an isolation ward, in a quarantine ward, and they no longer have infective contact, minus those that are in home isolation. And in home isolation, well, you need to multiply it with the fraction of contacts that are actually avoided. And so actually from these measures that we just imposed, we are need to calculate these effective numbers that can actually lead to an infective contact. Okay, and then we had in this flow diagram the force of infection. The force of infection tells you how many infective contacts you have between susceptible and all kind of infected. And let's see, what is the force of infection experienced by the general population? Well, first, they have contact with individuals that are prodromal. Prodromal individuals can already infect. And they do that as at a contact rate beta. And then, well, all prodromal individuals in the general population can infect them. Yeah? Now, obviously, you need to correct it with the contact behavior. Yeah? And then they can also have contacts with the staff. Well, with the staff, we need to be careful. Here we have just an effective number because we already sorted those out that were tested positive. They are in home isolation now. And then you have the contact with the risk group. And then you have the same thing with infective contacts with fully contagious individuals. Again, they can come from the risk group, the staff, from the general population risk group or staff. And then we have it finally with the late infective individuals. And of course, all these quantities depend on time. Yeah. So that is how the contact behavior then is modeled. If you're not so comfortable with the formulas, don't look at them. Okay, and so these betas are the infection rates in the different stages, and let's see how they are done. Yeah, so essentially, they tell you they are the base reproductive number R0 that you hear a lot about lately, multiplied by the probability that at a contact the disease is spread. That's the contagiousness, so to speak, that is differently. Well, the prodromal, they are somehow infectious, but well, then they become more infectious, and in the late period, they are less infectious again, right? So it depends on the stage. And you divide it through the average duration of time. So that is typically how this contact behavior are modeled. And the base reproductive number is just the number of secondary infections per primary infection in a population where everybody is susceptible. Yeah? And that typically has seasonal fluctuations. Yeah, so you model that with some kind of cosine function. Well, if you don't like cosine anymore, you forgot from high school what that is. Yeah, so it's essentially such a curve. Yeah, so R0 depends seasonally, and that would pretty much be Germany. Yeah, so day 0 would be when the epidemic started in Germany in early March. Yeah, and then you know it's getting spring and summer, and R0 is going down, and then you know it's going up again and peaks in the flu season in late December, essentially correlating perfectly with the UV radiation that you experience in that spot. Yeah? And so the base reproductive number, depending on in which state you are, is kind of time dependent. Yeah? And so you have a yearly average, I think that's 3.5 here. Yeah? And typically it fluctuates by 40%, 33%. That's the value that one knows from influenza. Yeah? So it's quite substantial. Yeah? So if you look at that, actually, there's quite something to come in Europe soon. Yeah, in Peru, you're lucky it's getting spring, right? So, okay, having said that, so R0 again is the average number of secondary infections per primary infection within a virgin population. So everybody is susceptible in the absence of any control intervention. And depending on the time point you start the infection, R0 is different because it has the seasonal fluctuations. Okay, so that is by R0, the definition of R0. Well, but it, I should say that is the definition that holds only in homogeneous populations. In heterogeneous populations, like here, you know, heterogeneous means like the risk group has a very different behavior than the general population and the staff population. Well, that definition changes, yeah, because you know, not every individual is the same. So not every individual will have the same number of average of secondary infections on average. Yeah. So in such a model actually needs to be calculated in a rather complicated procedure. You know, so it is, or the so-called, from the so-called next generation matrix. Yeah. It's not as difficult as it seems, yeah, but you need to be extra careful. You cannot just model it like naively. Yeah. Okay, let's move further. So you take everything as said, and then you build it in equations. Yeah. So it's quite substantial amount of equations you need for that, but it's all just bookkeeping. If you could follow the flow chart, it's just bookkeeping. Yeah. So we were not interested in the equations. So we are actually look at the results, and now the parameters are tweaked to resemble Germany. I wanted to try to tweak it to Peru, but it's so difficult to come up with this, you know, with these numbers actually, that I said, oh, let's stick to Germany. And so well, so we assume we test once per week, and we have a processing time of 48 hours. That's realistic. I just got a COVID test recently. I got one on Wednesday morning, yeah, and it was out at Wednesday evening, yeah. So 48 hours is okay. You can get that here, yeah. And the test sensitivity, well, they of course depend on the product, the lab, and so on. So we assume like different qualities, yeah. So we have a poor test, an intermediate, good, very good, excellent, yeah? Whatever that means. So, and they actually different sensitivity. And so you have the sensitivity in the latent phase, in the prodromal, in the fully contagious, and the late infectious. So the poor test, of course, well, in the latent phase, it won't discover anything. In the prodromal phase, well, it has sensitivity of 10%, then it increases to 65%, and then, well, in the late infections, it goes down again. Yeah, so that would be like a PCR test where it kind of correlates with the viral load in the nose that you in the saliva that you have, right? So the next thing is, then we have intermediate tests and so on. And then we go to excellent tests. Now, excellent tests is actually the sensitivity that is realistic now, by the way. I mean, this test getting so much better, right? So meaning like in the latent phase, 30% sensitivity, and then it goes up to 95% sensitivity. Yeah? So those would be like the numbers that are realistic. Yeah. And now let's see what we have. So if we actually do that, and well, we look at the output of our differential equation, that are our results. And now those are, let's look at the middle plot here first. That is the number of infections in the risk group. Yeah, just the risk group per 100,000 individuals. Now, what you see here in dashed is like the seasonal fluctuation in R0. Yeah. So in the black curve would be no testing intervention, so that would be the epidemic peak. And then in color is actually numbers of the different tests. So if you test with a poor test, well, it's substantially decreased already, and then it further decreases, and actually it starts to saturate. Yeah, you see a bit more of difference if you look at the susceptibles. Well, it's just by the contact reduction that you impose. Well, not everybody's going to get infected, so you will always still have susceptibles in the risk group, but you will have many more if you actually test. Yeah? And the better the tests, the more susceptibles, yeah? So the less infected. And here we have actually the number of deaths, yeah? Which is the important thing. And that is substantial. Yeah. So without testing intervention, you really with any kind of testing intervention, you substantially reduce the number of deaths. Substantially by a factor of 10. And then you can still improve it by improving the test quality, but eventually it's going to saturate. Of course, every death is one too many, but yeah, so definitely has an intervention. So the intervention was again testing once per week every employee, and we have a processing time of 48 hours. So they wait 2 days. So the most thing is like on average 9 days that they might be in the being infected and inside the facility, and that has already a substantial effect. Now let's look at the effects of the other parts of the population. So the top row is the general population, the middle row the staff population, the bottom row the risk group population. Again, it's the easiest thing to look at the number of infected. Now, well, the general population is not affected at all by this intervention. Well, they are not tested, right? It is just, some stuff that they are not seeing because they are quarantined. But, those are not that many. The staff population itself is also not affected. Who's really substantially affected is only the risk group. So it's particular a measure to protect really the group. Okay. Now let's look at the frequency of testing. How often should we test? Can we do better? Now let's assume we are testing from every day to every 2 weeks. And like with a good test or with an intermediate test, and again a processing time of 48 hours. You see again, well, the black line is of the comparison without testing. You see the testing intervention does something, and the blue line would be every 2 weeks. The green line difficult to see now, every week, and then we will have every 2 days and every day. But between once a week or once every day, there's really no substantial difference. So once per week is more than enough. You cannot really see the difference. Okay, and now let's look at the processing time. So processing time from 12 hours to 4 days. Here, really, again, the black line, we have obviously comparison without the intervention. But what's clear here is you don't see any effect. The processing time does not at all really impact the outcome. It doesn't matter if you needs just 12 hours or 96 hours to process a test. You have more or less, you get the same effect. So you don't need to be super fast. Okay, so it is not important. Good. Now let's sum it up. So what that model says pretty clearly is that testing the staff in long-term care facilities or in closed facilities in general is extremely efficient to decrease mortality. We had like a 10-fold reduction in mortality under the most conservative intervention. But remember, every second death occurred inside these facilities. So if you reduce 90% of these 50%, is a substantial reduction in the overall population. And then testing every 7 to 14 days with a good quality PCR test is sufficient. You don't need to be better than that. Tests are getting better and better. And they increased so much in sensitivity since March. So it is realistic, and they're also getting cheaper. The testing infrastructure is feasible. So what I did is I took these numbers and actually looked, what is the capacity of tests in Germany? And I think it's something like 1.6 million tests per week now in Germany. Or per month, I'm not sure now, but it's a lot. And how many tests you need for, no, it's per week. It's 1.6 per week. Yeah. Now you have a staff population of 700,000, but it's about 500,000 maybe that are really in the nursing sector. Yeah. You don't need to test those that are in some office in management positions and not inside the facility really. Right? So it's about 500,000, the population that you need to test. Now, if you test them once every week, yeah, the testing capacity is more than enough for that. Yeah? And also the infrastructure, I mean, the processing time you have, if you need 4 days to process such a test, it doesn't really matter. No? So it's realistic. And if you actually look at the costs, how much are the tests costing? Yeah? And how much are the treatment for influenza-like infections costing you in elderly citizens? Yeah? Then essentially you would reduce the cost of the damage by 50% if you with an intervention like that. Yeah, of course that is just a rough calculation. Yeah, but definitely it would pay off. Yeah, of course only the risk group is protected with this intervention. Yeah, so nobody in the general population get really any protection, but the risk group is the one wants to focus on and that needs most protection anyhow. Well, having said that, a bit of an outlook. Yeah. So in the beginning I said, well, I'm doing malaria most of the time. Yeah, but we used the COVID lockdown to take all the African collaborations that we have going on, and we started modeling coronavirus, and a lot of people participated in that. Yeah, let me mention a few then later. And so what we are doing is one thing is does multiple infections with COVID, if you're exposed multiple times, does it cause more severe infections? Like if the viral load is higher, so to speak, at the beginning. Yeah? How is that picking up on the mortality? So that is a project that we're modeling. Then we're modeling the effect of antibody-dependent enhancement during vaccination campaigns. So that means like that's immune backfiring. If you vaccinate somebody, you might think you immunize them, but actually you make things worse. And now once they get the infection, they really get a severe infection. Yeah, that can of course happen. So we model that. That's kind of a pretty complicated model setup to model actually such a vaccination campaign. Then we model what's actually happening with loss of immunity. Yeah. So we now know antibody levels are dropping of coronavirus, and you can get infected multiple times. So those are the questions that we are right now working on, a bit as an outline, what is there still to come up. A lot of people participate there from Africa. That is like Guillermo and Frank and Christian and George and Lois. Alinda, well, she's from Albania, not from Africa. Aloli, Mirage, Martin Eichner from University of Tübingen, Miranda from Lehigh University in the US, Gideon Nikwa from Cameroon. He's currently also in Mittweida, so I'm very happy to have him here. And he's making my lockdown so much nicer, I can tell you. Yeah. Well, we have Vincent, Aliu, Patient, Pierre, Jordan, Nesmar. I hope I didn't. Well, we have Francesca, we have Junior, they were also working on that. So we really, you know, I kind of assembled quite a gang to to do all the work and keep us busy in the lockdown. And yeah, well, I should also refer to this coronavirus simulation tool from Martin Eichner. That is essentially the key model. So that is an interactive web simulator that you can use. Hopefully, the article is soon out where we describe the model that's behind that. And so the modeling that we adapted here is essentially based on what's in there. Of course, we are always grateful for all the money we're getting from our funders, and hopefully next time we meet in person and go to a nice bar. I found one that looks pretty nice in Cusco last year. Yeah. So thanks a lot. And are there any questions?
Thank you, Christian. Stefano, ¿tú vas a moderar?
Yes, thank you, Christian. If anyone has a question, please raise your hand in the Zoom.
I don't find the hand. I will raise it here. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, Christian. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was quite informative. I'm not a specialist on mathematical modeling, so I just know very basic stuff. So I won't go through formulas and things like that. But because as you said, mathematical models have some limitations that, of course, they can provide useful information, but it's not the reality.
Yeah.
So which are the limitations from this model that you have used?
Okay. Very important question. Now this model, let's go back and have maybe some figures. Yeah, it's easier with that. So if you see these models and these epidemic peaks, what you can use these models for is to get prepared. Yeah, you would see essentially you can play around how effective are interventions. Yeah? And how many infections do you have per time? Yeah, what is the peak? How many hospital beds do you need? How many quarantine units and so on? So they are good for that. Yeah? Now what they are not good for is like for the initial phase. It's a deterministic model. Now in the initial spread of the epidemic, we will have a few individuals that get infected and they start infective chains, okay? And there's a lot of randomness involved, okay? So for those models, you can, for that initial phase, you can forget these models, totally. Yeah? But once you actually start an exponential spread in the population, once it really hits, yeah, you really get the numbers, yeah, and you can get the numbers to play with this kind of scenarios. Now, what people are doing is, like, for instance, that was fun. Like in Austria, you had like 14,000 infected cases, or a few infections, yeah, like in a cumulative, or with like 400 active cases or something. That was in my home country of Austria. Now then people use models to predict that behavior. Now that is obviously not the correct thing to do, yeah? Because this initial phase is not properly captured by the model. They are driven by stochastic factors, yeah? So you hear a lot of, in Europe at least, you hear a lot of the talk about the second wave. Right? So it hit somehow in April and then it went down. And so, people just think because they saw a little peak, it is like this peak, but it's not. the peak that they've seen is a peak that that is also here, but you just don't see it, yeah, because the numbers are so low, right? Here in the model, you assume, well, initially it starts, and then a month later you start with your general contact reduction, you start with your lockdown, and then infections go down, yeah? You see that, well, if I would zoom in, you could, on a proper scale, you could see it, yeah? But not on the epidemic, but the model, it has no purpose because the model will not be accurate there. That is a severe limitation, yeah? And one needs to be very careful of that, definitely, yeah.
Yeah. Yes, last question. And I presume you need very accurate numbers, right? Because also, for example, just an example, in Peru, well, it's, for example, the Ministry of Health was not reporting accurately the number of infections or a number of deaths. And so there were some models that came up in Peru regarding transmission, but yeah, no, they were not quite, I mean, they were not even close to what was actually happening.
Yeah. But one needs to be extremely careful with those. But one needs to be extremely careful. But it's not so much the data. I mean, a lot of people try to fit these models then with data, but especially initially, that is something that is that makes totally no sense, because these models are just applicable, you know, after some time when you have a certain number of infections. Otherwise, it's really dominated by stochastic effects that are not in this model, right? I mean, you cannot, no model can capture reality, obviously. You just need to say, okay, when is it okay? Like if you model the universe, yeah, if you model a star as a mass point, it's okay on that scale, right? Yeah. If you want to model, you know, the corona of the sun, then you need to model particles, actually, almost. Yeah. So it really, you know, it depends on the granularity you look at. And the initial phase is definitely not the right granularity. The only thing what these models tell you is, you know, how hard it's going to hit, yeah, and what's the effect of the intervention. And if it's eventually hitting, yeah, it's going like that. But you know, a model will always, and that's always a severe limitation. The model is just capturing what you put in there, right? So of course there will be kind of triggered contact reduction. Okay. Now, if I read in the newspaper, everybody is sick, or there are so many people in the ICU, in the ICU, then I might really be careful, right? Because you know, a lot of people would not wear their facial mask. You think, well, they don't get it. They think they don't have it, yeah, right? And of course, you get it, right? I mean, look at the American president. Yeah, he was never wearing a mask, and no wonder he got it. Yeah, that is just common sense, right? But maybe he's not going to wear a mask. Who knows? Those things are unpredictable, and you cannot. So that is not in the model, yeah. But it's more like a preparedness tool. Yeah? So you can do worst case scenarios, best case scenarios, yeah. And it's not like that you want to have one model, but you would actually, you know, play around with parameters. Of course, what you put in, what needs to be pretty accurate here is, you know, what is your population size, yeah. And so on, you know, what is the time of the lockdown? How strongly can you really reduce contacts? That's important, yeah? Because in a model, you can also say, I reduce 100% of the contacts, nobody's reduced. It's very easy to do in a mathematical model, yeah? But of course, in practice, you can't, right? So you always need to be, the art of modeling is not so much writing up the model, but correctly interpreting it. Yeah, and that, you know, and that's like with statistics. You know, that goes wrong a lot of times.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Is there other questions?
In the chat,
Lydia?
Stefano.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Kristan, for the talk. I think it was very insightful. Again, it's Christopher. I'm also not an expert in modeling. but it's interesting seeing how it's done. And thank you for the crash course. So very, very useful. I was wondering, like, what are the, maybe like the, how would you put it, like the limits of how much you need to model for you know that you have an accurate model, but at the same time that it's feasible to do, and that it's not, you mentioned variance was like a very like important thing in the model, so that it's not harmful.
That is again, you know, sometimes a lot of models that you see are often not good. Yeah. So that's a problem, and of course you need some experience to see it. You know, like last week I reviewed something that was beyond belief. Yeah, there was a model where everything was wrong, right? That happens. Yeah, well, it's like everywhere in research, right? I mean, so but. So you got to make sure what do you want, and you need to have a common sense. So like for you want to keep a model as simple as possible. Yeah? The simpler the better, otherwise you're over parameterizing. But with this kind of compartmental models, well, what you want to do is you want to model like the different phases of the infection. Somehow, well, one can say, well, do we really need a fully contagious and a late infectious phase? Yeah, or do we need the prodromal really? Yeah, one can discuss about that. Yeah, I would say yes, because you know it is kind of a distinct phase in your different, you know, the contagiousness is different. And also it is different when you can isolate individuals. I think it's important to model that prodromals, they don't have symptoms, they won't get isolated immediately. Yeah? So this makes sense to have this phase. Also, it's important to have like the latent, well, with the latent phase, you don't know. Yeah. Maybe that's in Corona, maybe that's so short that you don't need it. Yeah? That is on the order of you know, a day or two. Yeah, maybe. Yeah? The prodromal is also not very long. It's also a day or two. Yeah, and then you have 4 days. So for the fully contagious, where you have really the highest viral load, and then you have lower viral load. Now, I believe it's important for modeling testing. Right, because the sensitivity of the test will definitely depend on the phase of the infection you're in. So I guess that's important. So these stages are clear, and then we have recovered of that. Yeah? So here we already neglect those that are temporarily immune. Yeah, because for how long are they immune? Like for, you know, 2 months or so, for 2-3 months, and then they lose immunity. Yeah, if you look actually how long the pandemic peak takes, yeah, in the critical phase, that's much shorter than 3 months. Yeah, so I mean, nothing is happening within that. So that you can actually ignore, at least if you're interested, like here for like a year or something in the future. Yeah. Now, if you want to say, because by now, I mean, Corona is going to become our, you know, our running mate for the future, definitely, yeah, because it's going to be endemic. Yeah, we're better getting used to it because we're not going to eradicate it soon. Yeah, I mean, it's maybe like the smallpox in the next whatever 10-20 years that we can get rid of it. Yeah? But I mean, once it's there, it's very difficult to get rid of. It's like cockroaches in the kitchen. You see 2, yeah, then you have 100 behind the kitchen cabinets, right? That's just how it is. So you better, like if you want to have temporal immunity, if you are interested in how the endemicity is over time, then it's important to do that. But then you should also model natural birth and death. Yeah, so susceptibles, new susceptibles should be born, yeah, and some should also die of natural causes. Within 1 year, you can neglect it. Yeah, so I already stripped some of those things, yeah, to make it simpler. But what is important here is obviously, I think we have on one of the next slides, well, you need to distinguish between the risk group, the staff, and the general population. Yeah? And that is the minimum complexity that you have. Now you can distinguish, well, do you really need to have the substates? Well, if you want to have more, you know, more realistic response dynamics, you better do that. Yeah? But you don't really need it. And then for the staff, well, like if it was just for the risk group and the staff and we don't have any testing intervention, we don't necessarily need to divide. But for the testing intervention, we need to keep track on the of the tested staff, and we need to keep track on the risk group, because there is where we want to study the effect. So, and then, well, if we want to be realistic and say that test processing time is substantial compared to the duration of the infection, we better also keep track of that. And so it was really the minimal thing, although it looks like much.
Very connected to what you want to do, right? So basically, according to objectives, you define the parameters.
Yes, yeah. And you need to do, I mean, it's basically, it's a lot of being down to earth. Yeah, you just say, okay, what is plausible and what not, right? And you got to talk to people from the field, obviously. Yeah, so
so regarding that part, when you define the stages, I think it makes perfect sense that you define the prodromal stage, like all of these. Now, I was wondering regarding the late stage. This is a question about the biology of the virus. This is my my problem. But before a person dies, is it really always happens that the infectiveness diminishes? Doesn't it happen?
You can say on average, yes, because of two things. But you just say conditioned on that they die. Well, they don't just die, they don't get a stroke or so, yeah, they don't die immediately, right? It's not that they get hit by lightning, it's not instantaneously, so they are in a hospital, right? They might be very contagious, in fact, yeah, but they are, you know, isolated in an ICU facility, so they cannot infect anybody, yeah? So that is subsumed by that. Yeah, but it's very important. With the viral load, you also don't know, obviously. But like if you're really on the breathing machine, it's not necessarily that your nasal pharyngeal swabs show you positive results all the time. Yeah? So especially because, you know, if you are intubated, now it's very difficult to get it, and you're cleaned a lot. Yeah? So you wash out the virus, but obviously it affected the lungs. Yeah? So it's full in the lung tissue. So it depends also where you measure it. So the viral load is of course difficult to grasp. Definitely what's happening with too high viral, what's happening is before you recover, it goes down. We can agree on that, right? And if you die, well, if you have you just die from a symptomatic infection, yeah, and then you kind of reduce your contacts anyway. It's not that you go out in the shopping mall or in the disco, right? If you so that is actually why it's not necessarily to model that so explicitly. Yeah, but excellent question. Thanks so much. Lydia is your name, right? That was Lydia and Christoph, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So and you're both from the
And
initiative.
Thank you for the. Yep.
Great.
Sorry, what did you say? Sorry, I didn't hear.
No, Christopher, he's a postdoc at the University of Antwerp in Belgium, so he's your neighbor.
Oh.
And Lydia is she's from our group now, but she will start the PhD program at Texas University next year in the United States.
Oh, cool. Cool.
Thank you for the answer.
Very in Texas.
Okay, Stefan, there is one more question on the chat. Oh,
yeah, it's from Elizabeth. It says, what kind of data will you need to answer questions from the last slide of your presentation?
The last slide.
Yes.
Oh, how long it does it take to come up with those things?
Yes,
Elizabeth, maybe you can specify.
Yes, I was just wondering what exact data would you need to provide you scientists? When we design the research, what will be the variables that you need to measure just to take it in account?
Okay, yeah, I should say those are mechanistical models. Okay, so it is more about you know, how in which direction these interventions are working, right? A lot of these parameters will be very difficult to measure. So typically what one does with these models is to fit it with literature values. Okay, so what is the average duration of the prodromal stage, right? What are the sensitivities of the test? Yeah, what is actually, so those things, you know, are rather easy to get out of the literature. More difficult parameters to estimate is, of course, something like the case fatality rate, right? Because you have so many underreported things, and so you need obviously good estimates for those if you want to make good sense out of it. If you don't have good estimates, you just need to look at your model for a range of parameters and see, okay, you know, how is this, if you vary the parameters, how sensitive will the outcome be on that? Yeah? So it's really more like a predictive thing rather than a model that needs to be fitted. Yeah? So it's kind of very different what I'm doing with malaria research, where I'm always looking where it's called completely data driven, you know, where it's developing statistical methods to mine data. Here, actually, you don't need that much data for that. Nah? It is really just studying, okay, what would be the effect? Nah? It is kind of a preparedness thing. Yeah, because, you know, with this type of models, and you don't want to have, and obviously that is the downside of the model. You know, if these models suggest very good interventions, yeah, you know, if they say, well, okay, we can take now the results from that model and it clearly says, okay, if you have, you know, problems with an elderly population, which in pretty much all industrial nations you have, yeah. I mean, look at Japan, they have a huge elderly population, yeah, all over Europe. So, and they have a lot, substantial costs in the social system. Yeah? They want to know, okay, what is the effect of that? And we say, okay, here the model clearly suggests, well, you should test, and in these facilities, yeah, and that's an effective measure to reduce mortality. COVID-induced mortality. Now, of course, you will never find a data set that tells you then if you adopt that measure, what would have happened if you didn't, right? Because it's a one-time shot. It is really just a predictive thing to play around.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, is there any other question? Okay, I have one last question. Talking about the Peruvian context, one of our many problems is that we have overcrowded jails. So what do you think we can adapt these kind of models to our specific conditions? Do you think we have to like increase the number of parameters, but all the time make it like simple? What do you think?
Now, if you want to do it for the Peruvian population in prisons, you could take that model right away, yeah, and see what you can do. I'm not sure how relevant it is, though. Yeah, I mean, like, it is not a surprise that I picked the US as an example for the incarceration facilities, because nobody has so many, in prison per capita than the US. Like, also depends on how old the population is. In the US, it's really the elderly population in the prisons. I mean, like, you have lifelong in the US means it's really lifelong, right? I mean, it's like you don't come out of there alive, right? That's not like lifelong in Europe, which is at most, I think, 35 years. So, and it depends on how many. So the actual risk group is being 65 plus. Now, I'm not sure how much of a deal it is in Peru and how overcrowded the prisons are really, or how many people you have in prisons. But I don't think that it's so bad in Peru or in any South American country.
It is very bad.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, but definitely, I mean, once it is in there, it spreads like a wildfire. That's clear. But you can, that model could be applied for that. Should we try?
Okay.
We can try and feed it with the data.
Why not?
Okay, great.
No, we
Thanks so
can do
much,
that. I mean,
Kristan.
maybe it's interesting, but what that would be, if you can come up with the numbers, we can do it. We can write a little paper on that or a little note or whatever.
That would be a great idea.
Yeah, we can all, I mean, that's why this model is, are made for, right?
Yes, I think that the only problem in Peru is that the government mainly, well, the Ministry of Health mainly uses the rapid diagnostic tests that are based on serology, and the molecular tests were introduced a bit late, and we're not using a lot. So that's maybe one of the reasons why despite we started quite early with the quarantine, we have really a lot of deaths.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, in Peru, it's a nightmare what happened, because I remember initially Peru was one of the countries that responded the first, yeah, and then it just went through the roof so fast. But you see, in Peru it was getting fall, right?
Ah, yes.
In Europe, it was getting spring, right? And actually, in Germany we had a very nice April. It was the warmest April recorded ever since, and with very high UV radiation. So the virus don't like that, right? Now it's going to change soon.
It depends. For example, in the Amazon in Iquitos, it's practically summer every time. I mean, during the whole time, and we had really a lot of cases, deaths, and now there are some reports. They say at least 70% of the population have been infected. So they are speculating with herd immunity and these things. So I'm not sure if climate's.
That seems really. I mean, if you look here at the plots of the epidemic peaks, in the general population, it's per 100,000, So you have like 65,000. So it's like 65, 70% that will become you know, you got to look actually. Well, no, you got to look at who is left susceptible. But that means, you know, a lot that the large proportion of the population is going to get infected. I mean, that thing is just super dangerous. There's no question about it. Herd immunity, you know, I believe it's going to. It's very difficult. You know, herd immunity is something that's, again, you heard it a lot and you hear it a lot from modelers, but I think it's a super oversimplified argument, because the virus is going to change, and we see what's happening with influenza every year. And influenza, we have a vaccine for influenza since over 20 years, yeah? And it's still around. And no, it still kills a lot of people. Yeah? I mean, it's not, of course, by far not as many as COVID, but it is a nasty beast also, if you really look at it. And you don't have herd immunity there either. Yeah? I mean, this herd immunity argument is oversimplified. And what you don't know with herd immunity is all long-term effects of infections and so on. Yeah, and often, you know, one talks too much on the number of deaths, right? But not on the number of severe cases and long-lasting health damage. Yeah. Like 2 weeks on the breathing machine, yeah, and you know, and your life is not what it used to be, right? I mean, you will never be able to dive again or something, right? You have to learn how to breathe after getting off the breathing machine, right? You really don't want to end up there. Right, and then of course in countries with a well-established social support system, that means they will be unable to work. Yeah? So they are on social support for the rest of their life. Yeah? They might need additional medication for the rest of their life, and so it's I just see costs going up. Yeah, and of course the herd immunity argument just say, okay, let's go over it, right? Let it roll over, and then everything is as it was before. Yeah, but somehow I don't buy it. That is just in the clean graphics that you see in the model.
Yes, I think there is a lot of things now already. So thank you, Kristan, for the presentation. Before everyone leaves, please, can you we can take a picture?
Oh, that would be nice. Let me turn on my light.
Stop.
Okay. Can you
They need to stop
sharing?
sharing.
Oh yeah, sure.
Okay.
Very nice your flag.
Let me Alexa, Arbeitszimmerlicht an.
You have to smile, Kristan.
Yeah. But the good thing is Alexa is listening, so always.
Okay, everybody with the camera, please, so Stefana
Yes.
can take.
Okay, 1, 2. Okay, it's okay. 1, 2, 3. Okay, let me take one more. Yes. Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
1, 2, 3.
One more?
Thank you. Yes. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Thank you.
Cool.
Thank you, Kristan.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Maybe
Thank
next
you.
time we can talk about malaria, Kristan.
Yes,
because
I would
you
love
do very good models for that. Thank you very
Yes.
much, everyone. Thank you, Kristan. So
Yes, Thank you so much for having me here. How is it going with the recording? Can I watch it?
Yes, Stefano will send you the video.
Oh,
Yes.
cool.
There is a link, so you can go to the video.
Okay. Awesome.
Okay.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thanks so
Bye.
much.
Bye.
Okay.
Ciao,
Have a nice
ciao.
Have a
weekend.
nice
Bye-bye.
day. Bye.
Bye.
Ciao.
Bye.
Ciao.
Thank you.